Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you critical discussions with thought leaders in defense, security, and global affairs. I'm your host, Josh Malm. The CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through our events, research, and publications. In today's episode, we invite Alexander Lenoshka back on the program to discuss expectations for the upcoming NATO summit in Washington, the symbolism of NATO at 75, Ukrainian NATO membership and security guarantees, and the continuing impact of the Ukraine war on European security. Alexander Lenoshka is an Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of Waterloo and an MLI Fellow. This is the Expert Series. Alexander, pleasure to have you back on the program ahead of next week's NATO summit. We have a lot to discuss, so why don't we get started? What do you think might be the key agenda items or concerns heading into the Washington summit?
So I suppose there are two things. The first is the war between Russia and Ukraine itself. Ukraine has achieved more and more tactical success as of late, in part because restrictions on its use of Western-provided munitions against targets located within Russian territory have been lifted. Nevertheless, there's still a sense amongst a number of NATO capitals that in the medium to long term, Russia may yet pull off some sort of victory. And there has been some sense, too, that Ukraine may not necessarily liberate as much territory as perhaps believed some time ago. These, of course, are two things that are very much related with one another. So Ukraine is going to look for more assurances about support that it can receive, and there may be some packages that could be announced to this end, although so many of those packages do get negotiated on a bilateral basis. There probably will not be any movement whatsoever on the membership question because there's still enough internal disagreement within the alliance to thwart Ukraine's NATO aspirations at the moment. The second issue is simply one of symbolic politics. It's the 75th anniversary. There is a lot of unease as to how things are going to look politically by the end of this year with the U.S. presidential elections and the possibility that Trump could return to the White House. So there is some symbolic heft that attends this particular meeting. That does not necessarily mean anything of practical significance, but the fact that it's taking place in Washington on the 75th anniversary with these sorts of dark clouds looming over the horizon, not just in the United States, but also in France, given the recent first round of the parliamentary election, one cannot help but think that populism remains a major concern amongst a number of allies that could trouble the cooperation seen within the organization in the months, if not years to come.
Alexander, I think that's a great setup for the discussion, and I have a few follow-up questions for you based on your description of what we can expect from the summit. So I guess I'll follow up with maybe a question about the Ukraine war. How would you currently assess the military and geopolitical dynamics of the war, and have you seen any discernible shifts in control or strategy by either side as of late?
Russia is taking heavy losses. Russia has been taking heavy losses since the start of the full-scale invasion, to be sure, but the ratios seem to have reversed once more in favor of Ukraine, such that Ukrainian defenders are inflicting fairly punitive strikes on Russian forces. Russian equipment losses are pretty significant. There are estimates to the effect that by second half of 2025, Russia will be more or less out of much equipment. And we are seeing Russia undertake various raids or offensive actions along the line of contact that do betray a lack of force protection. They're basically having guys out on mopeds going about those tactical activities to, of course, their detriment. That being said, the front line that Russia has along various parts of Ukrainian territory remains pretty robust. How robust the rear is remains to be seen. We don't know. There are some who may argue that they're actually fairly weak. So if the Ukrainians are able to penetrate the front line, a very difficult challenge to be sure, they can still score fairly significant gains. I think, though, there is, as I said already, a sense in NATO capitals that Ukraine will not be able to achieve that much, that the most likely outcome is some sense of stalemate to the effect that Russia will be able to remain positioned on Ukrainian territory. I think this view is actually a bit unfortunate. Not that we should be overly optimistic as to what could be achieved against a well dug in adversary like Russia with all the resources that it has at its disposal, but it could create self fulfilling prophecies. It might make some allies disinclined to provide further military assistance when, in fact, more is needed precisely to unlock various elements of the battlefield. So there is some concern that I've heard expressed on the part of a number of colleagues that NATO may be resigning itself too quickly to certain outcomes associated with this war, not doing sufficient work to push back against the narrative, precisely because Russia is taking massive losses. And those losses have to result in some sort of negative dividend on part of Russia. There's no way that Russia can lose 50 to 80,000 military personnel without some sort of blowback. It might not happen anytime soon, but it will probably happen. And NATO should best encourage an outcome that could lead to disintegration of at least a part of Russian lines. So there is not so much a stalemate. There's a lot of attrition. It's a positional conflict to be sure, but my sense is that in the West, there's still insufficient support for Ukraine to really achieve strategic victory.
Now, when we say Ukraine may not achieve strategic victory or that there's a stalemate, what do we exactly mean by this? And what does that look like? Does that mean that there's going to be sort of a protracted conflict just continue indefinitely? Or is there some kind of agreement between the two parties that would be signed at some point, maybe unfavorably for Ukraine? What do you think the resolution, if any, might be from this vantage point?
To be sure, Ukraine already achieved a certain strategic victory by being able to withstand the first attacks after the 24th of February, making sure that it can retain independence and have Kyiv still stand in the face of Russian military aggression. So that is a victory of strategic importance on its own right. And that was indeed a major war aim that Russia continues to have that I don't think it will realize anytime soon. So when we talk about victory on the part of Russia in this particular context, we mean one that falls short of its maximalist aims, but does entail significant seizure of Ukrainian territory. Now, will there be some sort of negotiated, written down settlement? Those sorts of agreements have become less and less likely. We see in the record that countries are not only declaring war less and less, they're also negotiating peace treaties less and less too. I suspect something afoot is going to happen with Ukraine. There was no real declaration of war, so to speak, at least in the February 21st, 2022 speech. That was tantamount to a declaration of war, but was not legally made as such. Indeed, Russia was actually fairly eager not to use the word war to describe its own activities. A peace negotiation of the sort that'll be written in some chamber, in some European building, in some European capital is just going to be unlikely given the empirical record that we have seen. Moreover, as much as there could be smaller agreements relating to prisoners of war and the use of particular maritime routes and so forth, on the larger questions of the war, there'll probably be little to no agreement, at least on paper. There may be a tacit agreement about Ukraine ceding certain parts of Russian territory, But again, even such an agreement like that one would be domestically very unpopular. Any agreement with Russia would be seen as a temporary reprieve to the Russian forces, that they may gather their strength and break any agreement in the future. So there will be some sort of stasis that could result. I personally would wager that the war is going to continue for as long as Putin lives. This is his pet project. It's one that he began in 2014 and one, of course, that he escalated in 2022. He has no desire, it seems, to slow down. And so I think what will probably resolve the conflict more likely is Russia exhausting itself come 2025 and simply not being able to carry out large scale offensive operations of the sort that it tried and failed to do this past spring in the Kharkiv area.
I'm hoping you can touch upon the NATO security assistance and training for Ukraine package a bit, and perhaps describe what kind of strategic roadmap that NATO envisions for Ukraine's path towards deeper integration and potential future membership in the alliance.
I'll be frank, I think the main problem that is handicapping a lot of Western assistance to Ukraine is a lack of strategy. I think this is apparent with respect to how the United States, under the Biden administration, has been going about this issue. It's shown itself to be a little too timid, perhaps taking stated escalation threats too seriously on the part of Russia. I see this in Canada, where our leaders talk about being with Ukraine for as long as it takes, not for whatever it takes. So it's important for NATO militaries to train Ukraine armed military personnel, to give the wherewithal so that they can defend, if not to go about counteroffensives. That's all very, very important. But it all seems to be, unfortunately, taking place in the absence of strategy. The equipment and the training happens in fits and starts. Sometimes the training itself has been misaligned with what exactly is happening on the battlefield in various parts of Ukraine, that they are more aligned with NATO's own experience with combat operations over the course of the last 20 years, distorted as that experience may have been in the global war on terror. So these things, in principle, are very, very, very good, and they have been very, very useful to a certain extent for Ukraine. But there is no glue that keeps all these things together, and there's no overarching strategy that would allow Ukraine to prevail at a reasonable cost in as quick of a manner as possible. And unfortunately, we're heading into the second half of 2024 when there are serious doubts, at least in some parts of the alliance, about the perseverance of the military organization going into the future in view of the domestic politics of certain members. So that's a situation that we've kind of created. We have been slow, and we're just not very good at doing strategy anymore. There was a very good moment in 2022 to come together, use the shock of the invasion and the outrage that followed to devise such a strategy, but we didn't quite do that. We gave equipment in drips, and some of the equipment that we've given have not been very useful to Ukraine, either because they're in bad shape or they just do not operate well in parts of the local terrain. So I think that's been the question that's been hanging over a lot of the military assistance and training assistance that has been given to Ukraine. And unfortunately, that question I think will probably loom bigger.
To what extent would you say NATO's response to the Ukraine war, especially as of late, reflects the health of the alliance?
I would say that the alliance, notwithstanding everything that I've just said, has been much more robust than often given. It's a 32-member alliance right now. That's a lot of different interests that have been able to overcome what differences that they might have to provide important levels of support to Ukraine. If you think about other large alliances that have existed historically, they don't do nearly half as well as NATO. The Warsaw Pact couldn't survive regime change, and no one really liked it in the first place. The Collective Security Treaty Organization that Russia leads has seen a lot of fragmentation, no CS2 allies really giving meaningful military assistance, apart from perhaps Belarus, which has given a staging ground. Nevertheless, none of Russia's treaty allies there have given significant support, let alone have contributed to the fighting itself. We have, in fact, seen Armenia announce its intent to withdraw from the alliance. Whether they will actually follow through is another question. The fact that Russia has had to reach out and form yet another military alliance to North Korea suggests that Russia does not see its own existing alliances as adequate. So the fact that we have these difficulties within NATO is not one that we should dismiss. There are important challenges that the alliance does face and will face in the future, especially if elections go in a certain way in November in the United States. But it is an alliance with a history of lurching from one crisis to another, precisely because it is made up largely of democratic publics. It is a very large alliance in addition to that. But if you look at other alliances and just have a stronger sense of the larger empirical record as regards to military alliances, NATO is actually doing really, really well.
The recent debate between Joe Biden and former President Mr. Donald Trump has people seriously considering once again what a second Trump presidency might look like. So what adjustments might NATO need to make to align with potential shifts in U.S. foreign policy under a potential second Trump administration?
So I think we got one glimpse of how things would be under a Trump 2.0 with how Trump was envisioning the structure of U.S. forces in 2019, 2020, when he and his administration mooted a pretty significant shift in force posture of the United States as regards to Europe, calling for withdrawal from some assets, especially from Germany, and the relocation of others, perhaps in more flexible formats in and around Central and Eastern Europe. So I'm not sure if he would really go about a complete withdrawal from European security. What sort of predictions anyone can make of Trump, as you note, it would be very difficult. I think the United States bailed out Europe in 2022 with the sheer size of the military assistance that it gave to Ukraine at that time. Europe would not have had the wherewithal to go it alone back then. It needed the time. Unfortunately, Europe just needs a lot of time. I think in 2024, Europe is in a better position to go it alone. Maybe not as well as it could. The United States still remains an indispensable partner. But because of that additional time that the United States was able to buy, the Europeans have just much more industrial capacity now to go about and various deterrence and defense measures, in addition to providing military assistance to Ukraine. So in some respects, the alliance is a little more Trump-proofed than it would have been a couple of years ago. Is it perfect? Far from it. But unfortunately, Europe itself is very complicated. There are many other bureaucratic considerations present in that context. And again, things do move slowly, too slowly, to be sure. But I would say that defense industrial cooperation and production had been the most important vectors by which Europeans can assure themselves of greater security, regardless as to what happens this November.
Alexander, bringing it back to the summit for one last question before we close this out. I'm just wondering if you might be able to offer your reflections or thoughts about what Canada in particular can expect going into this year's summit and what kind of challenges might be there for us, as well as opportunities.
Canada's not done a good job at all. Canada's done a terrible job. Quite frankly, with respect to its own defense commitments, we've been very derelict. We're in the embarrassing position of being, I think, the only NATO country to, in fact, cut defense spending at a time when everyone else is increasing them, precisely because the world is becoming much more dangerous, and there's a greater premium on being as self-reliant as one can be, although that itself is very challenging in an interdependent context like the Euro-Atlantic. So Canada already has made it very, very difficult for itself. I don't necessarily expect it to be browbeaten over the course of the summit, but there is bipartisan angst towards Canada for its dereliction of duties in this domain. I think some European countries do not take Canada seriously. Canada sometimes doesn't even get mentioned in some leading policy and academic conferences. Canada is absent, and that is a challenge that will require a lot of national attention and resources that will require several years to remedy, unfortunately. So that's going to be the case no matter the substance of the Washington summit or even the election later this year. But it is one that Canadians should certainly recognize as characterizing your own country's place in this world.
Alexander, thanks again for coming on, and I hope we can continue this conversation again soon. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Stay tuned this Friday for the latest installment of the Geopolitical Update podcast hosted by Joe Varner. Thanks, and we hope you'll be tuning in next week.